So I live and work in a research center called Iracambi in Brazil, in the Mata Atlântica, which is the Atlantic forest, which I will show you a picture of. You notice our hummingbird logo. Does anybody here speak Portuguese? Can you figure out what it says? Doing our part. Oh, lots of people speak Portuguese.
Spanish.
You can do it from now. What would it be in Spanish? Siendo a nossa parte. Okay. There's a story, a Brazilian story about the hummingbird. The hummingbird, the forest is on fire, and all the animals are fleeing from the forest fire, and the hummingbird is going in the opposite direction with a little drop of water in her beak. And the eagle says, "Hummingbird, are you crazy? Get out of here. The forest is on fire." And the hummingbird says, "But I'm going to put it out." And she's going there with a drop of water in her beak. And the eagle says, "You'll never do it." And she says, "I may never do it, but I'm doing my part." So that we took that for our logo, and that's our motto, Iracambi. And I'll be telling you a little bit more about what we do. There is our webpage, iracambi.com. And I'm going to start up front by saying we're always looking for good interns and helpers, particularly from Duke. Okay? Got that in. So we'll be talking a little bit about rainforest sustainability, and this is notes from the front line. Okay, this is what life is like in the front line. This was not a Duke student, I have to add. It was an intern from another rather well-known university, whose name I will not mention, who was sort of under the impression he could park it in the fish ponds. Where we are, supposing I turn the lights down, would you be able to see better? Or doesn't that work? Is it all or nothing?
No, I'm not.
See if you can do that, yeah. You see there's a rope attached to it. What you don't actually see is there are a lot of people attached to the rope, and actually finally an ox cart, because we don't have pickup trucks in our part of the world. So I just want to warn you, if you do come to us and you do drive our Land Rover, please don't park it in fish ponds. Here we are, just to remind you of, some of you speak Portuguese or can understand Portuguese. Has anyone been to Brazil? Oh, you have, lots of you. Okay. Do you know where the Atlantic forest is? For those of you who don't know, this is the Atlantic forest down here. And this, of course, is the Amazon. We are the poor relation to the Amazon, but we are an extraordinarily interesting forest, one of the top 5 biodiversity hotspots in the world. Home to about 80% of all the endangered species in Brazil, birds, amphibians, mammals. The Atlantic forest is a really interesting place to be. Unfortunately, as those of you who know either Brazil or geography, most of our major cities are built along the coast. If you've ever been on a Brazilian beach, you would understand why. And this was, of course, very detrimental to the Atlantic forest, which has now been reduced to about 8% of its former extent. But it's still a very fine forest, in a fragmented forest, and we are in a very well-preserved area of it, which is preserved by virtue of being in mountains and being very difficult of access up dirt roads and rainforests. It really, really rains. So here's where we are. You see Rio de Janeiro here. This is Rio State. This is Espírito Santo Vitória, where you'll be going. And this is Iracambi. It's about 350 kilometers from Rio de Janeiro, all mountains. Isn't half a kilometer of straight road. So you better have a good stomach when you face that journey. But let me tell you, it's worth it. And in fact, the last emperor of Brazil who died, or who left in about 1889, 1890, when he paid a visit to our state, he said, "The view pays for the journey." So don't be distressed by the fact that it's all bends and curves and mountains and stuff. As you see, it's very beautiful. Our mountains are not unlike the mountains around here. And this slide has been sticking on me. So I'm going to have to, sorry, I think I'm going to have to go out of there if I can. You are looking at, while I'm trying to persuade this slide to move, you are looking at, whoops, okay, we've done it. You are looking at a patch of forest, and I'm not going to bring it up big because it's going to do that again on me again, which is a secondary forest The thing about fragmented forests in our area is that if you leave the forest alone, it will regenerate itself pretty well. And we actually had a student from UNC who was working on succession forests, which are next to old growth forests with us, and he found that the amount of species diversity in the secondary succession forest was about 70-75% of what was in the old growth forest. That's because they were right next to each other, and the secret of letting the forest regenerate is to keep the animals out of it. So here is the forest, the Atlantic forest, and hopefully, well, maybe, and look, it really looks better than that. Let's see if we can get it. What's happened here? This is getting worse and worse. Okay, gotcha. Thank you. We are our charismatic megafauna species in the Atlantic forest is, does anybody recognize this? Have we got any primatologists here? The woolly monkey. The woolly monkey is the most endangered New World species, even more endangered than the mountain gorilla. There are about 1,500 Brachyteles hypoxanthus, and so of course we use him because he's cute. We use him to symbolize the Atlantic forest. An important thing that you need to know about the Atlantic forest is, as well as the Amazon forest, of course, that it's a place where people live. And so when we are looking at forest conservation and conservation of this extraordinarily rich and diverse ecosystem, we have to take into account the fact that people live there. Sao Paulo is in the Atlantic forest. Okay, so there's a lot of people in Sao Paulo. In our area, it is an area of mountains, quite isolated, and our project area is about 3,000 square kilometers, and to give you a sort of feel for that, it's about the same size as the state of Rhode Island. It's a pretty big chunk of land. Mountain tops, a very important watershed, beautiful forest. It's a place of small farmers, small family farmers, and it's also a very important watershed. And most unfortunately for us, it's also the site of Brazil's second largest bauxite deposit. So when I am in this part of the world and in Colorado, you all understand how it is to be trying to work with conservation on one hand and mineral resources or extractive industries on the other. Iracambi, who we are. Let me start by saying that we started Iracambi 20 years ago now. 20 years ago, we got into a car. We were working in Washington, D.C. On sustainability, and wondered if it really worked. So we thought, well, let's go and try it. So we had a little difference of opinions. We, as my husband and myself, our children were at university and therefore pursuing their own lives at the time. And we made a deal that we would try it for 6 months. Well, this was 20 years ago. And to sort of soften the blow, we got into a car in Washington, D.C., and we drove down to Brazil, because that gave us a little kind of time. You can't drive the whole way, because there isn't a road. So when you get to the Darien Gap, you have to ship the car. But it was a real decompression time from life in the fast track inside the Beltway to life in the rather slower track in the rainforest. However, I have to say that now the speed of our life has picked up so much that people will come to us and say, how come you live in paradise and you act like you live in New York City? It's a good question. So we are a research center. We started with a patch of rainforest and a really stout effort at making a sustainable development project. Made every single mistake in the book, which endeared us to our neighbors, because you don't really want to go in and tell them you've got all the answers, and we certainly didn't. We started with a sustainable project, a farm. The farm is still the basis of the place. We then expanded it to include a research center and a non-profit. So there's our NGO. And what we're doing is trying to balance the good of the forest and the good of the people, and trying to work with small farmers who can be every bit as destructive as large farmers, to see how they can live in the forest and how they can begin to think of the forest as something that will sustain them, that they can make a living out of the forest without cutting it down. I can see you're making a face. We're not going to cut it down. We're going to try other ways, okay? But the people in the forest are there. We can't remove the people from the forest. We can't do what the United States did when it set up Yellowstone Park and moved all the people out. You know, this is not acceptable now. The people are there, so we have to find ways in which the people can work with the forest to the benefit of both of them. So the Conservation Center, we have about 100 students a year who come from something like 36 different countries. We ask people if they could possibly manage to speak either English or French or Spanish or Portuguese. We did once have a student who spoke apparently only Chinese, and that I found personally challenging, but she did a great job. And students come to us for anywhere from 1 month to 6 months because of visa requirements, unless they can get research visas and can enroll in a Brazilian university, in which case they can stay 1 or 2 years, and we have Fulbright scholars who do that. All the students who come to us, some of them are students, some of them are school leavers, some of them are college professors, some of them are midlife crisis lawyers. And we put them all together, and you know, it's very interesting, the sort of dynamism of putting people from different nationalities, different disciplines, together in a little house in the rainforest with no television. And because we talk to each other, and we talk to the people who live in the area, and the most extraordinarily creative things come out of that. Our two major research areas are managing conservation lands, because we are on the edge of a large and very well preserved stretch of Atlantic forest on the mountain tops. It's a state park. It's about 40,000 acres. And then around that we have a buffer zone. And I'm gathering that you don't have buffer zones around your parks, is that correct? Around your conservation areas? Just a conservation area and then it's the rest of the world. Okay, well, we have a 10-kilometer buffer zone in which we can set up environmental protection areas, and so there's a kind of, it's protecting the core conservation area. So we have the 40,000 acre park, we have a 10-kilometer radius buffer zone, and around that the Brazilian government, in a fit of real brilliance, I think, has created economic development territories, which are groups of counties that are clustered together around a specific development theme, and our development theme is payment for environmental services. So it's all based on the farm. So that 9 counties is where we get our 3,000 square kilometer project site. Population's about 150,000, about 70 or 80,000 of whom live in one town. So we're pretty scattered. We don't do well on roads. We don't do well on cars either, as you saw. And so it's, you know, a lot of places are really hard to get to. It's on your feet or on a horse. And that, of course, helps to conserve our extraordinary forest. The other thing we have to do is generate alternative incomes for our farmers, because they are subsistence farmers. They have a small farm in Brazil would be about 250 acres. Most of that is very steep mountain slopes. You are obliged by law to keep 30% of that under forest cover, so that the amount of arable land is pretty small. And in fact, according to Brazilian law, you are supposed to have riparian forests along the rivers, which in our case means that you actually won't have any cultivable land at all, because that's the only flat piece that you've got, you know, the valley bottoms. So our farmers are doing a fairly nice job with subsistence. They're growing, you know, rice and beans and sugar, and they have a pig and chickens, and they can feed their families, and the cash crop is coffee. And every time I come to the States, you know, I'm paying $3 or whatever you're paying for a fancy cup of coffee, which is what we get for a sack of coffee down there. And the price of coffee is always going down to the producer, as it's always going up to the consumer. So in the case of our farmers who are sort of hanging on by their toenails, they really can't afford to try other crops. They haven't got the capital. You can't get credit at all easily in Brazil. Our base lending rate is 18%. So what's your base lending rate? 0.5% or something? See the difference? And so really we feel that one of our jobs is to try out alternative income generating schemes and sources for them so that then we can work together and not have to stick to coffee, because coffee is a very demanding crop. As you know, tropical soils are easily exhausted, particularly if you have them under a monoculture. And when the price of coffee goes seriously down to our coffee farmers, the only thing they can think of to do is to expand their unprofitable coffee fields, and the only place they can do it is into the forest. Okay? Now this is against the law, but you know, what do you say when the guy says, I've got 6 kids to feed and I need to buy flip-flops for my kids, otherwise they're not allowed to go to school. So this is really what we're all about, is trying to find creative ways that people can make money out of the forest. We're based on a farm. Most non-profits, NGOs, are based in the town, so that's a huge difference. We're right under our neighbors' noses, so they can see everything that we do, good and bad. And we share, you know, heavy rains, crop losses, everything that we do in the context of the local community. And you see the fish pond there. One of the things that, when we first got there, we just watched. We sat very quietly and watched what our neighbors were doing, and they were growing the coffee. They had a few cows, because when we arrived it was a very high inflation time. Money was losing its value very, very rapidly, up to about 4,500% a year. And when you're in a situation where you put $1 in your pocket today and it's worth 50 cents tomorrow when you take it out, it's a smart thing to work with cattle, because a cow is something, she's money. You can sell her straight away instead of waiting for your crop to come in at the end of the year. And every, red-blooded Brazilian is a cowboy at heart, aren't we all? However, cattle and rainforest is not a very good combination. So when we saw, and extensive cattle raising is really what they tend to do. So we thought that maybe we could figure out ways of raising cattle more intensively and, with less bad effects on the forest. And so we started working on that. The word in Portuguese for meat, carne, applies only to beef. So as far as Brazilians are concerned, meat is beef. Some people eat pigs and stuff, but meat is beef. Now, no Brazilian will ever eat fish, because real men don't eat fish. And we had to do quite a lot of sort of subtle, strategizing to convey the idea that 1 hectare of pasture will keep 1 cow for 1 year. And most of those cows don't do, a whole lot. She'll produce a little bit of milk and she'll produce a calf. And, you can eat her if she dies or sell her. But 1 hectare of fish pond will produce 5 tons of protein. So once people had sort of got that and discovered that actually fish wasn't that bad, and we did sort of creative fish recipe competitions on the local radio and things like that. And now when you climb to the top of our highest mountains, you will see fish ponds everywhere. It's very interesting how we sort of had to pretend it was their idea, Oh, what a great idea, you're putting in a fish pond. Now that's wonderful, maybe we can help you. And once the first person had done it, of course, and had made some money, then it spread pretty much like wildfire. So what we need to figure out is how to make the farming, on the small-scale farming that they're doing, both environmentally and economically sustainable. And we are in a very water-rich area. It is so water-rich that actually in the last 2 weeks of December we had half our annual rainfall. I know you had some pretty weird weather here, but you didn't get that much snow, did you? We get a lot of rain. We get about 1,500 millimeters. So we got half of that in 2 weeks, which completely knocked us out. Even the trusty Land Rover, when she'd been pulled out of the fish pond, could not deal with that. Our river rose by 8 meters, and the Land Rover was not on for that. And we got a lot of landslides, knocked out the power, knocked out the internet. So we actually lit candles and sat by the wood burner and read books. And wonderful. But of course, this is really, really bad for our water management. we are trying to improve the soil quality, and we're doing this by planting nitrogen fixing trees and produce higher revenue crops. I'll be telling you about the alternatives that we're working on in a minute. And to increase productivity again. And most important, I think, people would say to us, you know, what are you farming? And we thought about that, and really what you need to do is try and help people, empowering people, farming people, because if you get the people to understand that they can do it, then they'll do it. Our area was very isolated. Mountain people, like you have mountain people not so far from here, mountain people tend to be sort of canny and conservative, and you have to really convince them for them to, you know, make behavior changes or make economic different choices. And we've started doing that really by discovering that the power in Latin America is held in the cities. And so therefore there's all the infrastructure is directed towards the cities. The schools are in the cities, the health facilities are in the cities, so that our teachers, poor darlings, would come up on our bus. She was called Our Lady of Perpetual Succor. And Our Lady bus would make it up the mountain dirt road, if she could. She couldn't always, of course. And bringing the teachers, so they would have a 45-kilometer ride, which might take an hour or 2 hours, or might never get there, and then they would have to walk. So we had no schools, no health posts, no roads, no telephones, because from the point of view of the people who have the power and the prestige and the sort of political clout in Brazil, the countryside is suitable for people to look after cows. Or Indians, they would say, forests are for Indians. So we decided that the only way we could get past this was to work with the people to see if we could set up a new county in our little one-horse, half-a-horse town. It's a town of 1,200 people. And we worked with the local community to get a petition, send it to the state governor, who lived hours and hours away across the mountains, unimaginably far away, and send him a petition and ask him if we could set up a new county, which would mean that we would get federal funds. And that happened. And we also managed to elect a good mayor who did not put all the federal funds straight into his pocket. So now we have schools and health posts and free internet access and road machines. But most important, we've got people who figured out that, yes, we can, right? If that rings a bell. The NGO, we're working with, when you're out in an isolated area, you work with whoever is standing and breathing, right? You can't choose your colleagues. You have to work with everybody. We work with government authorities. We work with local school children. We work with the farm families. We work with our international and Brazilian students. And together we are, it actually makes a very creative mix thing. And we're working on programs, projects, and as every NGO is going to get involved in, like it or not, advocacy. And the advocacy in our case comes from the very unpleasant discovery that we made that mining concessions had been given for almost all our beautiful conservation area. These mining concessions had been given out 25 years ago when there was a military government. There had been no consultation, no discussion. And of course, mining companies in Brazil, as in America, as everywhere else, are not in the least bit interested in any kind of public consultation. So we, who thought we were going to be looking after rainforests and working with small farmers, found ourselves mobilizing the local community against these really big, tough mining companies who do not like to have any argument and are quite capable of sending their strong men after you. So by mistake, really, we got involved in advocacy, but we realized if we didn't do that, then all the work for the rainforest would be wasted. So our programs, we're working with managing conservation land and generating alternative incomes. Managing conservation land, you see there one of our wise men. We go out and scour the hedges and byways to find wise men who know the trees, who know the medicinal plants, who know the soils, who know where the water sources are, and we work with them. You only need one wise man at a time. Two wise men don't usually get on in the same room. So this is one of our Monday, Wednesday, and Friday wise men. we have others on the other days. And he's working with a boy from the local community and an international student. And he would go round the forest trails with us, and we would have somebody right behind him with a tape recorder. And he would be telling us the uses of the trees and the plants. And since we have 10,000 plant species, it's really helpful to have somebody to guide us through that. Managing conservation areas, we are in the buffer zones. In order to protect the core conservation areas, we're creating environmental protection areas. And according to Brazilian law, they get some level of protection. They also give the county green dollars, which are in theory to be used for protection and conservation. You have to make sure that that's what happens to the green dollars. And they are to be set up in a participatory fashion with the local community. Managing committees are to be set up. Management programs are to be set up. And of course, in an area like this, this is a really difficult concept for the local communities. So we have to start from the ground up. And we go out and do participatory rural assessments in the local communities. We work with making maps, starting with crouching on the ground and drawing little maps of their farms. We work with oral histories about how the community was built up. Our area has only been settled for about 60 years. Before that, it was just forest. We work with people evaluating the stakeholders who are working in the area. Who is most helpful to us? Is it the church? Is it the county? Is it the school? Is it Iracambi? Who are really the actors in this? And then when we've got that, and people are beginning to sort of acquire some community feeling, because it's not innate in rural areas. People tend to live in their little corners and don't have an automatic kind of community feeling, perhaps accelerated in our state by the fact that the state was founded on gold mining. And if you found gold, you know, you stay in your corner. If somebody comes along, you probably pull out your shotgun. Certainly not going to go out and put your arms around him. So in order to create a kind of community spirit, you know, it's a long job. We have been there so long and have, you know, turned over so many Land Rovers and done so many stupid things that the community has kind of taken us in. I think there's nothing like making mistakes for people really thinking, well, poor dears, they'll try their best, and so they're behind us. Here we are, for example, this is one of our GIS maps that we made of the conservation area, and here are some of the local farmers talking about and thinking through how we are going to make environmental protection areas, how we're going to spend the money, and what resources we need to really protect. We are working on forest corridors. You're familiar with the concept of forest corridors. Our forests are fragmented, and in order to persuade farmers, most of our land is privately held, the forest is privately held, to yield a little piece of land for a forest corridor, that forest corridor had better be useful to him. So we make a forest corridor which would be, say, 60 meters wide. It would have a core of native forest species, and then on the outsides, on the fringes of that, we would decide with him what kind of species he would like to plant, if he'd like to do agroforestry, if he'd like to put in bananas, because then that land is going to be productive. In fact, before he yielded that land, it was probably not productive, because generally speaking, farmers don't do very much on their fence lines. And we usually try and do it on two farmers' borders, so that two farmers are both yielding 30 meters each. And if they are involved in the planning from the beginning, we try and get the school kids to come in and help with the planting and make a kind of party out of it. And of course, there has to be maintenance to get the plants going. This is the way that we can actually sell that idea to farmers. And once you've sold them on that, they're really quite keen. We're also acquiring very endangered patches of forest to the best of our ability. We do this by marketing this to school children in America and Europe, who, you know, adopt a little patch of forest. Of course, they can't buy it, but they can adopt it, and we have a nice little scheme going whereby kids say that they, baked a million cookies or hopped around the playing field on one leg for 3 years and raised $50. And so we are expanding the forest, sort of core forest conservation areas, and our deal is that we put them under permanent protection with the Brazilian government so that they are protected for life. And when you see that picture, you'll see why this is so important. We have a forest nursery, a large forest nursery. We have about 450 species in it. And this is always one of the most popular places in our research centre. If you've lost anybody, you can nearly always find them in the forest nursery because it's a really nice place to hang out. It's quite hard work, and of course we do a lot of planting. We have just planted 5,000 native species in the planting season from October to December. And luckily it wasn't all rained away when we had half our annual rainfall. And that is part of an experimental agroforestry plot. Next year we'll be putting in the food crops after the forest crops have got a head start. And of course our forest crops grow extremely quickly in Brazil. Alternative incomes, this forestry leads into farm forestry. It is not an easy concept to grasp. How about we plant trees? This is not a sort of easy thing for people who traditionally have seen the forest as a barrier to progress. And, you know, we hear a lot about Brazilians knocking down their forest. Are there any Brazilians here, by the way? No. We hear a lot about that, and, of course, North Americans and Europeans did it long before the Brazilians did. And if you think back about forests, there are all sorts of thoughts and fears associated with forests. Forests are places where, you know, goblins and baba yagas and things live in the forest, and there's this feeling you see when you're working with people who are moving into the agricultural frontiers, particularly in the Amazon, and they come from farming areas and they say, we came here and this is really scary, the forest is over our heads and we want to cut the trees down and let the sun shine in. So the concept of actually planting trees is quite a tricky one. Of course, we're a large country like you, and large countries tend to be wasteful, God help us. And there's always, you know, more land, so we can cut down the forest and move on. But we are beginning to work, of course, with the children. This is the way to do it. With the kids, we grow seedlings with the children and then go and plant them with the children. And it's in the same way that you get kids here to plant rutabagas, which they would never eat if they didn't plant them, and then they eat them. Well, it's the same with us. They're planting trees and, of course, very proud of their trees. And we had one little girl, little hamlet, about 4 or 5 kilometers away from us. She went through our environmental education program, and she inherited, according to Brazilian law, at a very young age, a patch of land. And all land is divided amongst, you know, all the heirs. Makes it very complicated. And so all her sort of family descended on her. They all had ideas as to what they might like to do with her patch of land. And they said, well, little girl, you know, maybe we could help you plant this or plant that. And she said, great, I'm going to plant trees. And this was, you know, a real first. And we put her on the community radio, and she became quite a kind of rock star. So it is happening. Medicinal plants, you saw our wise man. One of the things that we discovered was that if we can look for medicinal plants that are native to the forest, then there's an economic incentive to keep the forest up. You are supposed to keep 30% of your forest. If you can find medicinal plants, if you can sustainably harvest them, that's very important, of course, so they're not all extracted straight away. This one is called capeba, and it grows on forest edges. And the leaf is about like this, it's big. And we've been doing a sustainable harvesting project on that with the local farmers and selling it to one of the big cosmetic companies in Brazil. They use it for sunscreen. It took them a while to figure out how to make sunscreen that wasn't green. I would have thought the green sunscreen would be a real seller, but Brazilian ladies don't like green sunscreen. Anyway, it's now white. So this is one of our plants, and this involves, you know, some very careful managing, because we have to figure out exactly how much can be harvested from each person's forest plot. And, you know, please do not take all that you have, because then, first of all, we won't sell it for you, and secondly, you won't have any next year. And, you know, this is beginning to work. And another thing that we're doing is making soap out of these tinctures from the medicinal plants. And this is immense fun, of course. I bought some of our soaps to Boston last year and showed them to a friend, and she said, I can have them in Whole Foods in a heartbeat. And I said, if only. We're a very small operation, but we have learned how to do that. So anything that we can do to add value, people are very proud of their soaps because they don't have to buy soap anymore. And we are, looking to sell in the kind of middle class. There is a middle class in Brazil, to the city people. And anything that we can do to add a little value to our basic, resources. Payment for environmental services. We have a water credit scheme. Are you familiar with water credits? Do you have any kind of water credit scheme? The way it works with us is if farmers who own springs or river banks protect the springs, plant more trees, they are, in a sense, generating water. Now, it's very difficult to get the data to prove how much water we are generating, so that's one of the things we're doing, is getting the kids to measure the water flows and measure the water quality. But we have managed to persuade, even without the hard data, the downstream water company to pay just a few pennies, and just these little tiny kind of incremental incomes for the farmers, a few pennies to those farmers for planting and protecting their springs, of course, really does generate a more stable water supply for the downstreamers. And we are working on associating water credits with carbon sequestration credits. Now that's a difficult one because it's much easier to do that on a very large scale, quite complicated to manage a bunch of small farmers. But we have found people in Scotland who work on smallholder carbon schemes, and if anybody has any ideas about that, I'd love to hear from you. And if we can associate water credits with carbon credits, then this really becomes interesting to our farmers. Also, of course, working on ecotourism, low-impact ecotourism. We've had our first pilot schemes, walking horse safaris. We have wonderful waterfalls, staying in local houses, going around in pony carts. And international students and international visitors really love this. In fact, we had our pilot scheme was with a group of Americans who were over for a conference in a nearby town. And I met them in Washington after they got back, and they said it was the best holiday they had ever had. And the local community was really excited. And we got into the local community something like $300 in 3 days. Now that's a lot. So having set up that expectation, of course, it's now up to us to make sure that we can keep up the supply. And we are working with, training people to be guides and to see how we can improve the local cooking and selling handicrafts and so on. And I think it's community-based ecotourism, and I think it's a very good alternative. You really need to keep your place clean and tidy. You really need to keep your forest. And anything that we can do to encourage people to keep their forests and make money is valid as far as we're concerned. Of course, none of this would happen without environmental education and outreach. So the Gallant Land Rover goes and collects kids from the school, brings them to our forest trails. We have a community radio program and try and get the kids and the people to give talks. They're much more interested, of course, to hear them than they are to hear us. Here is something that was the basis of our GIS. We managed to get some aerial photographs. They're very expensive and hard to get there. And interestingly, the people in our area who have had maybe a fourth grade education, because that's all that was available in rural areas, these young women can barely read and write, but they can do the picture. They can do the map. And you can see how excited they are because we're looking down. This is where my boundary is. This is where your boundary is. And then from this, we started to make hand-drawn maps, and then that led to our GIS project. The forest monitoring. Our GIS project is the first community-based GIS project in the area. It's powered by magnificent master students from Clark University. We're happy to have magnificent master students from any university. If any of you is a magnificent master, or even not, please let us know. And our feeling is that we know what data we need. Everybody is able to collect that. Everybody is a researcher. We tell you exactly what we need, and the kids go out and they get the data. They help in monitoring the growth of the trees. They help monitoring the water flows. They absolutely love it. Nothing more fun in a hot climate than playing around in the water. And we are collecting this data, putting it into our GIS, which is online, and which is available to the local counties. It's the only planning, it's the first and only planning tool. They've never had any land planning, so everybody is extremely excited about this. And we're very, very happy. This is a student, but we take the kids out to do the monitoring. And here's the Iracambi GIS. Now here you see our project area. The purple here is the park. This is the buffer zone. And all this red stuff here are the mining claims, which we discovered, and we generated that map. And the mining company, of course, did not expect to find anybody who was going to stand up to them. We made the mistake of putting that map on our website. We were so proud of it, Clinton. I mean, I know it's not great, but you know, it's pretty good for us, right? We put it on our website, and by golly, the mining company stole it. And then when we had the first ever public hearing to discuss the incredible, I mean, the huge impacts of mining on a whole generation or 2 generations of people. This is $1 billion worth of bauxite. It's not going to go away. We can't be incoherent. We do use computers. We do use cars. But we can have a really good shot at making sure that the mining companies do this as decently as possible, and stay away from the core conservation areas, because some of these mining claims are actually, you know, right inside the park itself. Now, it's a problem for a country like Brazil, which is, you know, a big, important country, which is very busily, you know, getting a trade surplus and exporting ethanol and so on. And of course has traditionally always exported commodities. And so now it's trying to not export raw commodities but to process them. So pulling out the aluminum, this aluminum, it will all go to China. It's kind of ironic because Brazil is the world's champion beer can recycler. We are really good at recycling our beer cans, but this will all come to China. So when we heard about this, I went off to the Colorado School of Mines and asked them to help me analyze an environmental impact statement with mining in it. I didn't know how to do that. I know how to do it now. Anybody wants to know about it, I'm happy to tell you. Mining company did not expect that, and as a result of that, we found all kinds of holes in their environmental impact statement and managed to create enough public indignation that the entire mining of all this area, which has not yet started, has been put on indefinite hold. Now, this is probably not going to last forever, and of course commodity prices have gone down now, which gives us a bit of a breathing space, but we are under no illusions that, you know, that aluminum will come out at some point. And what we're doing in the meantime is trying to get the community brave enough, because you have to be brave to take on these guys, because they play really dirty. Brave enough to stand together and not let them be knocked off one after another, because what the mining companies will do, of course, is just go to each person one after another and try and do little deals with them. And we have to make sure that people stick together and then can face up to the mining company. Mining company didn't pay any attention to the question of our water resources, never even entered the environmental impact statement. They talked a lot about endangered species. I think they had gone to a local farmer and said, here's a picture of an elephant, do you have elephants? And he said, oh yes. He just wanted to get them out of the way. So the environmental impact statement, you know, bore no relation to anything in the area. And once we had analyzed it and taken it to pieces, the state government in fact said no. But this will not last forever, and we need to be alert and working on that. Something will happen. This is one of the maps that we did to show these are all the bauxite deposits. And you see all the water sources, lots and lots of little water sources here, little streams. Under Brazilian law or any other law, I'm sure you're not allowed to have, you know, open mining within so many meters of the river. Do you know about that, Heather? Is there a rule that you're not allowed to be within 20 meters or 30 meters of a river if you're doing open cast mining? There must be. Oh, well, of course you do it in the rivers, yes, you do. Yes. Well, we do have laws.
It probably depends on the area, the site.
But, you know, just to show something like that to the local people, when they actually see something like that, then they can get their heads around it, and this is one of the reasons that helps us to mobilize people. So we are intensely involved in public policy and advocacy. It's very important to do that. So my job is, I travel a lot in the States, and my job is really with international students, and we have this little discussion about who we serve, because the folks on the ground say that we're serving the local communities, and I feel we're serving the international communities, but the truth of the matter is, if we weren't doing good stuff with the local communities, the international community wouldn't be interested. And if we didn't have all the energy and brains of the international community, we wouldn't be able to do what we do with the local community. So that's another thing that we're balancing. And here you see a Yale professor who's working with us, and a bunch of people at the first ever public hearing. Nobody knew what a public hearing was, and this is where we sent the mining company away for now. What we need to know is whether this alternative development model that we are trying to do. Brazil is on the one hand going for huge development projects, huge hydroelectric schemes, huge soy projects, you know about the cattle, you know about the logging, but there's also a very strong movement for small farmers. There are a lot of small farmers, there are movements for the landless and so on. And there's really, you know, a solid move towards fair trade, you know, local foods, slow foods. You familiar with slow foods from Europe? Food that comes from locally, and it's the opposite of fast food. Our food is very slow. And these are all things that people across Brazil, and particularly in the areas of family agriculture, are working on. And you know, I really hope that now, in the face of this perfect storm that we've hit, with all this combination of crises, the economic crisis, the environmental crisis, the climate change crisis, that there will be a real place for small farmers and for a slower and more, you know, sane way of life. Fair trade, organic produce. I have to tell you about organic produce. One of our local farmers is a coffee farmer. He's one of our wise men. His children moved away to the town, and he abandoned his coffee field. And we said to him, we'd like to work with you on the coffee field. It's been abandoned for 3 years. It's had, you know, no pesticides or anything on it. And in 2 years, we can have that certified organic. He said, well, I can't lose anything. So he paid him a very small, you know, gave him a little tiny sum of money to encourage him. And we went and worked with him. And after 2 years, he had his first organic crop. And we entered it into the organic coffee fair, and he won. And not only did he win, but somebody bought his entire coffee crop for 3 times the price that it had been, you know, that anybody else was getting for their non-organic coffee. So this is a real incentive, and people are, you know, getting that. Healthy food, we have, for example, a producers cooperative, because we have a lot of bodies to feed. We have an average of about 20 students, plus about, you know, 7 or 8 assorted other bodies, staff members and so on. And almost all our food is produced by the local farmers. Working really hard to stop the use of pesticides and fertilizers. And again, the price of commodities went very high, so the price of fertilizer is very high. So generally speaking, our farmers can't afford them. Healthy people and healthy economies. And, oh, I got stuck again. I don't know what's going on here. Sorry, guys. Let's see if we can get out of here. There we go. Now, I have just come from the World Social Forum. Now, where do I get into it? There we go. Oh, yeah. Sorry. This is the one we need. Does anybody know about the World Social Forum? Is it anybody go to it? We're going to be discussing it tomorrow in another class. Has anybody heard of it? Have you heard of the? Yeah. What do you know? Have you ever been?
No, I haven't.
You haven't. You know about the World Economic Summit in Davos. That was held a couple of weeks ago, where all those guys who got us into the muddle they got us into were discussing that stuff. For the last 9 years, there has been a People's Alternative Summit called the World Social Forum. It started in Brazil, down in the south in Porto Alegre. It's been held in Brazil, and then more recently in other countries. It was in Mumbai, it was in Nairobi. 1 year it was held simultaneously in several different countries. And this year, for the first time, it went back to Belém in the Amazon. It was the first time they'd had it there. And it seemed a very fitting place to have it in view of the kind of climate change and environmental crises. And the agenda of the World Social Forum is another world is possible. Let's figure it out. It's a civil society thing. It's not a government thing. We had 5 Latin American presidents, but they had to be invited. They couldn't just swan in. And it's a meeting of civil society, people from across the world. We had 150,000 of us. And we were looking at what kind of a paradigm can we come up with now in this most urgent hour of our need to see whether another world is possible. Otro mundo, otro mundo, an anderer Welt. And for 5 days we were all together in Berlin discussing it. Now it's a forum, it's a discussion place, but it was very important this year that it shouldn't be just another talking shop, shouldn't be just another UN conference. It should be really come up with some thoughts and strategies for moving forwards, and time will tell whether we really manage to do that. Being in Brazil and being in the rainy season and having 150,000 people descending on Belém, Brazilians somehow or other hadn't realized that there are only 8,000 hotel beds. But we all kind of shared. 15,000 young people set up a young person's camp. It was really very exciting. And as so often on these occasions, the best things happen. They're not programmed, they're not scheduled. Very often the scheduled events, for some reason don't happen or disappoint, but the unscheduled events where you're actually standing in line waiting for the bus that's never going to come because they didn't think about busing people around, or you're walking for miles, or you're sitting by the river, or you're on a boat. These are the times when people network and changes happen. And I think that another world is possible, and I think that maybe out of this movement something will happen. This was the opening parade. 150,000 people downtown. Whoever scheduled this parade was probably not very familiar with the Amazon, because this was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And guess what happens at 3 o'clock in the afternoon? It rains. And in fact, it is so regular in Belém that you make assignations before the rain or after the rain. But at 3 o'clock, the rain came down, and it kept coming down till 5 o'clock. And we were all absolutely soaked. We had water up to our knees. But we hung in there, and that was the beginning. And that was the beginning of the discussions about another world being possible. And this is what we're trying to do it for. We're trying to do it for the future of our kids and all the kids